And there's my cat meowing. Perfect start. Welcome to the Zachrilege cast. Thomas Westbrook, happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Now, you, of course, are very teetotaler in terms of podcasting, but I, of course, will have beverages. So these are both ones I got in Tennessee. Black Bell's is a honey-flavored barrel-aged stout, and then to make the people at Cognitive Dissonance mad, it's a Neapolitan bourbon barrel stout. It's funky flavors in one beer.
And I am drinking some high-quality H2O.
See, it's always, branding. I'm surprised you don't have like
Koolaid.
Holy Koolaid like wine glasses. Not available quite yet.
I have gotten a couple glasses here and there. Most of them, I did have like this goblet that was super awesome looking that I had for sale on my website, and then they stopped carrying them. So that was kind of sad. But I've got some coffee cups and things like that. But a goblet would be cool.
Well, at this point, you were on the show. Gosh, I think it was like 2.5 years ago, which is way too long, of course. I make the silly mistake of like having people on and not like following up in regular basis. So I'm glad you're here. But now, how old is Holy Koolaid now?
I've been full-time, I think, for about 4 years. My first video launched probably about 5 years ago, but I wasn't full-time at first. I just put out a video, and I was working a full-time job, and I would have months between any kind of content. And then right around the time that Trump got elected was when I was like, all right, I need to go full-time. So coming up on 4 years here.
Well, good timing. Yeah, you'll never have enough content with the crazy evangelical and Trump connection. Well, let's have a couple of quotes from you. Not necessarily, I think last time they were definitely not out of context. And these, well, you can tell me if they're out of context or not. Dying from hail is extremely unlikely. Well, of course, tie in with your latest research projects. And they say time flies when you're having fun or when you're slaughtering the Amorites.
Yeah. I mean, I think context is a little bit important to understand those quotes. If you'd like, I can dive in and kind of explain.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So with the first one, there's a story in the Bible in the Exodus where the Jews have just left being slaves in Egypt, and God has delivered them into the promised land, and they're going to conquer this land that God has given them. And in the quest of their conquest, they are told that they're supposed to kill every single inhabitant that lives in the region. And so they come in and they just start, there's like 5 different armies that team up to try to take on the Israelites, who apparently are as, plentiful as the stars in the sky. There's basically, the Bible's like, there is a metric, I don't know if I can swear on your show.
Please do.
But fuck ton of Israelites that are, invading. And so these 5 armies, team up. They start fighting with the Israelites. The Israelites team up with another army. They're going toe to toe. It's getting really intense. And the Israelites are worried that they're not going to win this battle. And so God summons down this massive hailstorm. And it says that more people of, the enemy army died from hail than actually were killed by Joshua's army. And so I thought about that for a second. I was like, can hail really be that deadly? Like, is that really a thing? And I started to look it up and I started doing research. And what I found was that the Guinness World Record, like the most people who have ever died from hail in, like, I'm talking the most extreme weather in the Himalayas. I'm talking in the most population dense regions in the world, in like India and Bangladesh. And this is with, from like 125 years ago. So the stats aren't very good on it either. A lot of them probably died from like their shelters getting knocked over or freezing to death or lightning. There's a lot of things that can play into it. But the most people that have ever died from hail, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, is like 235 or something like that. And so the notion that this storm, that God would rain down hail on people, and that, we're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers potentially being killed in this slaughter fest. I'm like, hail just doesn't work like that, especially when, if you've got armor, you have helmets, you have shields that you can put above your heads, it doesn't make any sense. And, there's a few other cases where like you look in like modern times, the comparison, and it's like you have maybe 4 people in the last 10 years with like thousands and thousands and thousands of hailstorms throughout the continental United States. 4 people have died from hail. It just doesn't happen. It's like extremely, extremely uncommon and unlikely. And so this story, I was like, okay, one of two, like you can interpret the story a couple ways. You can say either one, it's all miraculous and God just, decided that he was going to make basketball-sized hail and he was going to hit people exactly in the right spots and he was going to do it to tens of thousands of people. And you have to appeal to God magic and say like, it doesn't make sense. It's not a natural phenomenon, but God did it, which is kind of unfalsifiable. And it's, you can do that with Noah's Ark. You can do it with the story of Jonah and the whale, like all of these impossible miracle stories. You can just say, well, God did it. And it's an easy cop out. Or you can say it's absolute BS. And this story, it did not happen like that at all. And, it was probably some legend that people wrote down and completely twisted the facts, blew things out of proportion, took a storm and basically said, maybe there was, people got struck by lightning or something, maybe some people froze to death or whatever the case may be. But they're like, oh, God killed more of them with hail. And it's this extremely exaggerated man-made account, but the story is BS. What you can't do is you can't take a middle ground approach and be like, well, this is just 100% a historical account. And these things happen all the time. And it's just very normal and very common. And, these are just people writing about normal everyday occurrences. It's either full-blown miracle, insane over the top story that you can accept or you cannot accept, or it's not. And it's either legend or myth. And so for all the people in the middle who are like, well, I'm not a young earth creationist, but, all of this stuff is based in history and based in fact. I'm like, well, bits and pieces of it might be, but how loosely it's based in fact, I think is much, much higher than what people, most people realize.
Yeah, I would just say that the writers of any holy text probably were not counting on any kind of fact checking.
Oh, clearly not. There's stories all throughout the Bible where like one of the most famous anachronisms in the Old Testament is the existence of camels a good almost 1,000 years before camels were domesticated in that part of the world. So one of the ways that you can tell when, humans domesticated certain animals is you look at human settlements, especially places like mines or trading villages or places where people are going to have animals that are beasts of burden that can carry loads like camels, like oxen, donkeys, things like that. You look at, okay, when you dig down to a certain point, you start seeing, okay, here there's, camel skeletons, no camel skeletons. Okay, let's dig down over here in this place. Camel skeletons, no skeletons. Okay, and we start doing that all around it at human establishments, human areas, urban centers and stuff, mines and places like that. And you start seeing that, okay, past a certain point, there's no camels. And when you do find camel bones, they're sporadic in the wild away from settlements, or you might find some bones, but like, when you date the bones that you find of the camels, they date back to around like the 9th century BCE, right? Which is about when they were domesticated. And any camels that you find before that, you can compare the leg bones of the camels and say, okay, if these camels are bearing a lot of weight, they have people riding on top of them, they have massive loads where they're carrying goods and stuff, the bone density of those camels is going to be thicker because just the weight and the burden on the bones, causes, I think it's calcification, but I'm not a doctor, but like you see thicker bones in the camels, in the leg bones, than you do with wild camels. So if a camel is just hunted for meat or something, a wild camel is, shot with a bow and killed and taken into the camp and eaten, then you see a difference in the leg bone structure. And so it's little things like that there's a lot of clues that tell archaeologists that camels were not domesticated in that region until around the 9th century. They may have been domesticated elsewhere, but not in Canaan. Now, when you start reading through the stories of the Old Testament, you have between 600 and 1,000 years before that, you have story after story after story of, Abraham having tons and tons of camels, and it's a sign of wealth, and it's, Abraham and his large flocks of camels. And then you've got a caravan of trade camels coming to pick up Joseph and take him to Egypt. And there's over 20 mentions of camels throughout that period of time. But it's like, if we know that camels weren't domesticated until the 9th century, then, or the 10th century, maybe at the earliest, then why is it that we have hundreds of years beforehand, we have accounts of camels? Well, it's something that you would expect if a story is written anachronistically. Like if a story is written after the fact and someone is, saying, oh, okay, what is a sign of wealth? Abraham was super wealthy. I know about camels. Camels are a sign of wealth. If you have no idea when camels were domesticated because you're writing it, 300, 400, 500 years later, you're just going to assume camels have always been around. You're like, oh yeah, Abraham was really rich. He had to have had lots of camels. So you're not going to know about that stuff, and you're going to just put these things into the story after the fact. So it's, to say that the Bible is historically reliable, I think you miss a lot of these little details that, someone who is a historian or an archaeologist or something might be aware of, and they might be able to tell you that stories like the Exodus or stories like the invasion of Canaan and stuff like that, that there's just not the evidence we would expect to find. And the evidence that we do find seems to be contradictory.
But Thomas, didn't the Catholic guy say that the Bible said that the slaves cost 20 shekels when they probably should have said 30 shekels? That was one of those comebacks that I think the Catholic guy that you did the kind of rebuttal video mentioned. That's like one example as opposed to camel.
He was pointing out that the slave price at the time in Egypt was 20 shekels, and the person wrote down 20 shekels correctly. And, it turned out later on the slave price went up to 30 shekels. And he's like, well, how did they get that right? If they got that right, then it must have been written down at the time or close to the time of the story actually taking place. Now, the actual text that we have of the Bible aren't from, we don't have text until the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is like, I think maybe 200 BCE or like 250 BCE is like the oldest text of the Bible. And that's not like the entire Exodus story. That's like fragments. We have, maybe the entire book of Isaiah, which is a much newer story, but like stories like the Exodus and stuff and the story of Genesis, there's thousands of years gap between like the story of Noah's Ark and like the first account that we have written down about it. And so to me, like I look at that long time period and I'm like, okay, so if that's the oldest, like if there's that big of a time gap in between there, and God is apparently, this is his perfect word to mankind, and he's trying to preserve this story for us to be able to find him and speak to him and know him and stuff, why are there no preserved records of the Bible at all close to the time of them being written? It might have been written down way earlier. It might have been loosely based on a story from way earlier. But why don't we have it preserved? Why is that not there if it's so important? God could have written a giant tablet made of diamond that is like indestructible, huge, the size of a mountain, and just had his holy text put in there. Like, he's God. He could do anything. There's so many ways that he could preserve or have his text, saved until modern times. But instead we have papyrus scrolls in Egypt talking about, the erotic undertakings of people, basically the equivalent of the Egyptian Kama Sutra, that survive to this day, that are much older than the Old Testament fragments that we have. Why is it that God was able to manage to allow those to be preserved, but not his holy text? And so, and stories like, okay, the slave price they got it right. It was 20 shekels instead of 30 shekels. Did they? They could have known.
Example, and then if you look closer.
And when I say did they, let me specify, because I'm not saying that the slave price wasn't 20 shekels at the time of Egypt. What I am saying is it could have been that the person writing in modern times was like, oh yeah, the price of a slave is 30 shekels, but they really wanted to get rid of his brother, so they sold him at 33% off at a discount.
Happy hour or something, yeah.
It could have been that, or
you weren't there, right? That's one of the lines always here. You weren't there,
or it could have been that this person, they actually had some history books, or they had done some research, or they knew that the slave price had gone up, or they knew how inflation worked, or something like that. Like, I don't know. Like, that's speculative. I don't know how they got the slave price right. I don't know if they got the slave price right, or if they just said that he was sold at a discount. But the point is, there are other anachronisms in the Bible, and there's a lot of stuff there's evidence that we should find if the Exodus story took place that we don't. And there's a lot of contradictory evidence that we do find that shouldn't be there if the story was true. And you add that on top of the fact that the Bible hasn't been preserved well, even though you have, verses like in the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount, you got Jesus saying, not the least stroke of a pen won't disappear until everything is accomplished. It's like, well, clearly the least stroke of a pen has disappeared because we don't have the original text. There's so much in between that. Like, we have no idea how much it changed. We have no idea how long it was carried down by word of mouth, which is a horrible way to transmit a story. There's just too many variables in there for us to take this as historically reliable,
Yeah, I've often thought, like, I've done just a little bit of study of like how the New Testament came together, and a lot of that stuff was written, decades, centuries after the fact. But it seems like a lot of the Old Testament stuff might be centuries, might be a millennium, and there's no way to get to that golden like original text, which when you see it, I'm sure it's not going to be as exciting as people say. But maybe we can go just a tad bit back. So how did you get, since you do have to plan your shows in advance, you do weekly shows, you do animations, you do a lot of research, you do a lot of work for all this, but how did you get to doing a series on the history of the Bible and focusing on the Old Testament, which I don't think gets as much attention like by contemporary standards as the New Testament does?
So I'll answer the first question and I'll tell you why I think it doesn't get as much attention. How I got on this topic was my entire life I've been studying the Bible. From the time I was super, super young, I was studying the Bible. And I was memorizing massive sections of scripture. I memorized like the Sermon on the Mount, a good chunk of like the book of like Philippians, random Psalms, Proverbs, a lot of the stuff that you hear in church. I read through every single gospel multiple times, read the Bible cover to cover. And I was a church camp counselor, a youth pastor, a worship leader, a missionary kid. We had Bible studies every morning, devotions every morning as a kid. I went to church. I went to youth group, at least once a week. I go to church camp. That was what I grew up on. So in a way, I don't necessarily have a formal training in the sense of, I didn't go to seminary school. I didn't, get a master's in theology, but I do know my Bible pretty well. And then when I went to college, I spent a year first at a Christian college, and I did have, a formal biblical studies course. And I have, looked into it and studied it because I wanted to know if it was true. Now, taking that as a background, I did reach a point where I started to get kind of tired of it because I was seeing and hearing the same things over and over and over and over again. And I started, really diving into science and trying to see if, like, is there any science or is there any anything that backs up these stories in the Bible based off of how we understand how the world works? Can we test this? Can we use the scientific method? Can we study forensically, look at like archaeological records and historical records to see if this matches up? And in that process, in that journey, I wound up becoming an atheist. Now, when I became an atheist, I was kind of tired of the Bible and reading all these Bible stories. So I wanted to look more at, bigger philosophical questions. Is the universe fine-tuned for life? That's not just a Christian question. That can apply to, did the Hindu gods make the universe? Did Allah make the universe? It could be just, is there a God? Deistic, whatever it is. I started looking at, is there any harm that's caused by religion? Why are atheists mad? How do we deal with grief? Like, there were so many questions that I had that as I was learning and unraveling this stuff and figuring out, how society works, how morality works, how do we get here, how science works. As I would, discover these things, I wanted to pass on the stuff I was learning to people in a bite-sized way where I would take my aha moments and I would condense them down in an animated short form laser focused video for people to share that journey. And it's been really popular. It's taken off. But in recent times, I've come back to the story of the Exodus and to the Bible because I was really fascinated with UFO conspiracy theorists. And I was really fascinated with people who say that the aliens built the pyramids. I was doing a debunk battle with one of my friends, Steve, and I tasked him with debunking killer mermaids. He tasked me with debunking the notion that dinosaurs built the pyramids. And in that process, of looking, because, there's claims young earth creationists sometimes will say, like, look, dinosaurs were used almost like cranes. They were used to help, people were riding them and they were domesticated and they were helping lift blocks and stuff to build the pyramids. And I was like, okay, that's not true. here's what we know about the pyramids. And I fell in love with ancient history of or ancient Egyptian history and Egyptology. And I just spent like 2 or 3 months just completely immersed in ancient Egypt and learning so much about, what we know about how ancient Egyptian civilizations worked, how society operated, how much we have, how much we know. It's insane. Just how many there's like, I think the top 10 museums in the world on like with Egyptian artifacts and stuff have almost 1 million. It's like 900,000 artifacts in just like the top 10 alone. Like that's, and we've uncovered like just a fraction of what there is to discover, but like this was a huge thriving society. And so as I started kind of learning what we know about how the pyramids were built, we know most of the puzzle pieces. There's like a few that are kind of, it could be this, it could be that, it could be this. We're still piecing stuff together, but it's pretty obvious that it wasn't aliens and it wasn't Jewish slaves. And in that process, I was like, well, is there any evidence for the Exodus? Is there any evidence for, Jews ever living in Egypt? And what I found again and again was no, the evidence isn't there. The evidence that we should find, we don't find. And instead we see a lot of contradictory evidence. And so, and I'm not going to say, a lot of times Christians will be like, well, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's just because we don't find evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. I'm like, well, it does mean it didn't happen if the evidence should be there. So the analogy that I give in my videos is, let's say that I come to you and you're my insurance agent and I say, my car got completely pancaked by an 18-wheeler the other day. And you come over to my garage to inspect it and it's in pristine, perfect condition and there's not a scratch on my body. Then you're going to say, well, I'm sorry, there's no evidence that this is true. This is your car. Your car looks exactly the same as it did before. You said it happened like 2 hours ago and your car's fine. This something doesn't match up. The evidence should be there if this story happened, if this is true. And it's kind of the same way with the Exodus story. If you have between 2 and 12 million Jews living in Egypt for 400 years, obviously not that many in the first part of the 400 years, but reproducing and building up this culture that is, maintaining their cultural identity, maintaining their religious beliefs, worshiping one God, having, rebellion and plagues and things like that, and then booking it across the Sinai, the Pharaoh's army entirely being wiped out in the Red Sea, and then people wandering around Sinai for 40 years in the desert before invading the lands of Canaan and conquering all the tribes there. You should see massive amounts of evidence for that. And there just isn't any. And it's there could have been, maybe a small band of people here and there, a small, there were different tribes and groups and stuff, the Habarus, the Shasu, the Hyksos, that were all kind of Canaanite tribes or Semitic tribes that had, little interactions with Egypt. Some of them would trade, some of them would be like bandits and mercenaries, some of them conquered. The Hyksos actually conquered Lower Egypt and ruled for a while and set up their own pharaohs and then were driven out. And it's possible that there's remnants of those stories that were carried on over into the Old Testament as us leaving Egypt, us fleeing Egypt, maybe us being under Egyptian oppression, because Egypt actually conquered Canaan and conquered, where the promised land Israel is today. They conquered that whole section and set up, these vassal states. And then when they were driven out, it's possible that these stories of, we were under Egyptian oppression and Egyptian rule, like those stories lingered on. Like there's a lot of stuff that could account for these stories existing. But the story as is told in the Bible cannot be literally taken seriously. It cannot be taken as literal history with the complete lack of evidence that is there and the evidence against it that exists.
Well, I'm not sure if you'll have an answer for this, but it seems like, from my point of view, and at least in terms of who has come back on your videos to like rebut them, does it seem like it's mainly Christians? Like, I don't think Jewish people take that so literally as Christians do, because the Christians feel like our story has to be true all the way to the beginning, and the Jewish people are like, yeah, we made these stories up and they're good stories and that's about it.
So it depends. It depends, because I was in Israel a couple months ago in late November, and to say, do Jewish people is kind of like saying do American.
Very, broad thing, but it seems,
You know,
generally.
and then even then saying do Christians take it literally versus do Pentecostals, do Catholics, do, because even the Catholic guy who did a response video to me, Trent Horn, he was even like, well, it clearly wasn't 600,000 Jews. It was probably a much smaller group, and they probably took these stories from oral traditions and passed them down. It's like even he was kind of hedging a little bit and not going with the direct literal interpretation of the story as it happened. And I'm like, I think there's a lot of Christians who do that too, who are like, well, okay. Now with Jews, most Jews they're not necessarily as concerned with conversion as Christians, who have this great commission to go into all the world and convert all people. And so they're not necessarily going to be as vocal about it. But you do have people, like Dennis Prager, who is a Jew, who will talk about Judeo-Christian values and talk about the stories of, how valuable the Ten Commandments is, and how, and I'm pretty sure he believes this hook, line, and sinker, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think he's a young earth creationist, but I'm pretty sure he believes in the story of the Exodus. And when I was in Israel, there were cult-like groups and sects where you would have, certain regions of different cities that were like, okay, this is where this Jewish cult lives. And they don't really go outside of that group. They have their own internal news that's cycled around. They have strong censorship on what ideas can be passed around. And they're, those places, if you were to go in there and say the Exodus story did not happen or is not literally true, many of them will get upset about it. And when Jewish newspapers will publish, articles like, you got Haaretz and stuff saying the Jews were never slaves in Egypt. And you've got, Jewish archaeological groups saying, there's no evidence to support that whatsoever. And the ultra Orthodox and super, conservative Jews who will believe in this story literally will come along and say, that's not true. And, how could you? And this is blasphemy and stuff like that. So there is pushback. We just don't see it as much in the States because most of what we do see is from the Christians that we're surrounded with.
Well, how was that trip to Israel? Like, what got you over there? And I don't know, what kind of stories can you tell about your time over there?
So I went to a conference. There's the Machar annual atheist conference in Tel Aviv, and they invited me and Cosmic Skeptic and Genetically Modified Skeptic, that's Alex O'Connor and Drew McCoy, to go and speak at this conference. And while we were there, we got to see some different sites. We went to Jerusalem. We got to see the Via Dolorosa, which is the route that Jesus took from the cross, allegedly. We got to see the place where he was crucified and buried, allegedly. And I say allegedly not because I'm a mythicist, but because even when I was a Christian, I would have seen those locations and been highly skeptical that those were the actual locations. Because it's like the reason that they think that it's the spot is because there was, I think it was like Constantine's wife or his mom or someone went and visited.
I feel like it all started like the whole tourism thing back then, but it's just intriguing to be in that area because a lot of people go there, are religious or at least have that background. And they go to all these holy sites and they get these feelings. And of course, in your case, you're probably going there and like, okay, they're showing me something. Like, did they show a tomb?
Well, so there's
like structure, perhaps.
There's about, and I'm not sure if the distance or the time I'm going to get this exactly right, but it felt like it was about a 5-minute walk from the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, which is allegedly like the last wall of the temple. I think it's the outer wall or something. I'm not sure on the exact details, but you've got the Jewish temple, and inside you've got the Dome of the Rock, and the Muslim mosque is now situated there. And then just a few minutes walk away, you have this area where it's all inside of this building. It's now like a big Orthodox church, and it's separated into different churches. So I think you've got like, I could be wrong on this, but I think part of it is owned by like the Armenian church. Part of it is like the Roman Catholic church. Part of it is like an Orthodox. It's kind of split up, and they manage different sections of it. But allegedly that's where Jesus was crucified, the rock he was laid on, and where he was buried. And it's all like right there in one spot. It's all like you can literally stand on the rock where he was laid down and then look over, and the tomb is like right there. And when I would read the Bible as a kid, I always pictured or envisioned that like he was taken outside of the city on top of this giant hill, Golgotha, Skull Hill or whatever, that he was crucified there, and then he was taken down and taken to a tomb, somewhere else. But instead it's all just kind of like right there. And now it's all like massively like inside of the city and everything. And I'm sure that there's a lot of archaeology that goes into, or biblical history into why they think that that's the location. Everything that I was reading on it, everything that I was finding on it was that I think it was like Constantine's, and I'd have to look this up, but it was either his mom or his wife or someone went to the Holy Land to try to find, where Jesus was buried and find different artifacts and things. And obviously she doesn't want to come back empty handed and let down the emperor. And there was like a temple for Athena, and they said, oh yeah, there was rumors, word of mouth passed down that there had been hundreds of years ago that when the temple was destroyed, or that like a temple to Athena or something was erected right where Jesus had been crucified. And she dug down and found a bunch of crosses and sent them back to Europe and sent fragments back and stuff. And of course now there's so many alleged shards of the cross, and there's so many, forgery epidemics going on of, you could probably build a entire crucifixion forest out of all the relics. There's like 19 or like 30 nails that they say are like the nails that crucified Jesus, which would make him like a divine pincushion. So I'm not convinced by those stories. I don't find them necessarily the most compelling. But even if Jesus was a real person, and even if he died, and even if those were the real locations, there's still ample reason to be suspicious of the miracle claims and stuff. Personally, when I visited those churches, or that main church, I was utterly underwhelmed. And I think more than underwhelmed, I was kind of depressed. And I was expecting to go in and kind of be awed just a little bit by like, oh wow, this place has such rich history and it's so magnificent and it's beautiful. And instead, like, I went in and it was kind of a dark room, and it didn't really, I've been to some magnificent cathedrals. I've been to the Hagia Sophia multiple times in Istanbul. I've been to the Church of Christ Our Savior in Moscow, which is like one of the biggest, if not the biggest cathedral in the world. I've been to, St. Basil's Cathedral. I've been to, a ton of different Orthodox and Catholic and, various, magnificent Protestant churches. And I found this one to be very, very meh. And not just meh, but like there were people who had clearly were not very well off, or not very wealthy, at least. They were kind of average middle class or low class, who, looked like they were foreigners. They probably had saved up to make this trip, this pilgrimage out here, spent a significant chunk of their savings. And that happens with millions of people every year traveling to the Holy Land. And they're showing up and they're prostrating themselves on this rock, just sobbing and weeping and crying over this stone. And it's like a rock on the ground. And they're just crying. And I know, like, as a former Christian, I understand why they're doing it and what they're doing. They're hoping that there's, it's more like they're so grateful that their sins have been forgiven. They're so sad that Jesus had to die, and they're, overwhelmed with emotion and grief and stuff about the story that they've been raised with and indoctrinated with. And at the same time, like, I can't help but kind of feel sorry for them. I feel like they're being duped. I feel like they're in this utterly underwhelming, unremarkable place, just bawling their eyes out, sobbing, feeling like they're broken, feeling like they're sinful, feeling like they need forgiveness for something. And, they walk outside and there's just row after row of merchants and salesmen, which I know isn't scriptural. I know that, Jesus drove out the moneylenders and stuff, but it just seems like a giant tourist gimmick. And it seems like people are being completely fleeced and they don't even realize it.
You should do a video about that. I know
I did.
Like, yeah. And you're an atheist, you got to do videos. I mean, come on.
Yeah. I did a video called An Atheist Visits the Holy Land.
Well, what was you probably met not just like one group of people, but what was it like to meet fellow atheists in Israel. Like I've been mainly stuck in the U.S., so I'm intrigued to see what it's like to meet people in what people consider very religious countries. Not like the U.S. isn't.
Yeah, it's their experience is very similar to ours here. They have, I got to meet with people who had escaped from Jewish cults. I knew people who were, or met people who were shunned by their families. There's one person in particular who was trans, and they're like, honestly, I got more shit from my parents for being an atheist than for being trans. And I know that that's not the experience across the board. Some people who are LGBT, when they come out of that closet, they face way more discrimination and hate than when they question their faith. But it varies from person to person and family to family. But it was very interesting in these environments where you have a couple people who are, they're trying to promote skepticism and critical thinking, and they're trying to get people to think outside the box and to not be so, fundamentalist, because you're in a country that is probably the most divided by religion. You have three different, massive global religions all claiming that it is their holy land. It is their, you've got the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians all seeing it as like the center of their faith, and they're all fighting over it. And, you've got countries that are, trying to, you have Palestine and Israel both trying to exist in this one small patch of land. And one of the biggest dividing factors is religion. And, because there's more than enough resources there for the Palestinians and the Israelis to be able to live off of that land. There's more than enough there for both of them to be able to get along. And in some cities they do. And in some cities they coexist and stuff, and it's fine. And then you go to, other parts, and you can see a very clear, chasm between, for example, Tel Aviv is much more liberal. And there's, parts of Tel Aviv where you just see people living and working together in harmony. And then you see, and they'll find ways to work together. So, for example, when it's the Sabbath, all of the stores close because it's the holy day. It's, Saturday, everything shuts down. Stores shut down. You're not allowed to do anything. You're not allowed to, do stuff. But the Arabs are still allowed to work. The Muslims are still allowed to work on those days because they're not Jewish. They don't have to practice the Sabbath. And so you'll see Jewish shops stay open, and they'll have Arab shopkeepers manning the stores, and they'll even pay them extra to work over the Sabbath, but they'll have, basically Gentiles operating their stores and stuff. But then there's other things that affect everyone. Like when I hopped in the elevator at the Hilton, on the Sabbath, it stopped at every single floor. And there was only one elevator operating. So I got in it, I think on like the 15th floor. It went up to like the 20th or something. I forget the exact numbers, but I stopped in the middle. It went all the way up to the top, and then went all the way back down floor by floor by floor to the bottom. And it was like I have a video recording of the whole thing. It's like a 5-minute elevator ride where I'm just sitting on the elevator going do. And then like I get off the elevator and I'm like, yeah, when I hopped on this thing, I was 5 years old.
Okay, I'm going to do something really strange for this show. I'm going to actually ask a question that Jeannie posted in the chat room. So what is for you, this doesn't have to be for anybody else, what for you is like the atheist version of like, do we have a holy land? Do we have a place that we want to visit other than your studio? Unnamed studio, by the way. We're going to work on that. That's a new project for you.
The atheist version of Mecca. I don't know, because there are places where, I want to draw a distinction between an atheist and a scientific skeptic, because you can be an atheist and be a flat earther. You can be an atheist and believe in all kinds of paranormal woo and nonsense and psychics and ghosts and everything. I think that there are places where there are science meccas where people are like, oh my God, here we can discover about how the universe works, and it doesn't have to be a god. And and it could be places like the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, or it can be places like you go to LIGO or something, and you're like, holy crap, here's where we detected gravity waves. Or it could be more historical. We could go to the Pantheon or the Parthenon or something and see, in a sense, the graveyard of the gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon, of the people who played such an important role in everyday, day-to-day religious and superstitious theology and mythology. And you're like, this is no longer a thing. Like, we don't really take any of this stuff literally or seriously anymore. And so it kind of gives us a little bit of hope that maybe that's where we can reach as a society, where we can take all the elements of philosophy and all the elements of, morality and ethics and stuff, and we can incorporate those into society just fine without believing in bullshit too. And so I think that there's elements of it that are not, I don't know if I would call that necessarily Mecca. There's countries that are more secular. Iceland's pretty secular. Scandinavia is pretty secular. So if you want to just hang out with secular people, the atheist community of Austin's pretty great. A lot of people come out here. Faithless Forum Conference. But I wouldn't necessarily call them like an atheist Mecca, because we don't do pilgrimages. We don't have rituals. We don't walk around rocks. We don't think that your sins need to be forgiven. We don't think that, you're incomplete as an atheist if you haven't completed the 5 tenets of atheism. We don't have tenets. So I don't know that we have a Mecca, but there's a lot of places that are really freaking cool that you can appreciate probably more once you're an atheist.
Yeah, the only thing I could think of was, you did the video where Christopher Hitchens kind of did a rebuttal because he debated Dennis Prager. And it's like, well, were there places that Christopher Hitchens did really, debates that are really famous that you might want to go to? Like, did he do a debate in a church somewhere, like in England, that you might want to go to? But yeah, I could see it being more of a scientific thing. Like, yeah, go where the Apollo missions took off from, or go to Houston, stuff like that.
Even that, it's like, I see this a lot with religious circles, where if there's something that, oh man, this is the place where, Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal, and it's somehow infused with this spiritual significance or this power, or there's, almost like the location has collected some of the spiritual essence and it's a holy place or a holy site. This is, the rock that Moses struck. This is the cross where Jesus died on. And religious people love to have superstitious hangovers from the past where they're like, there's some type of spiritual power or essence infused in these things. And like, we just don't have that. So it's like, there's places that are historically significant, and it's like, oh yeah, that's really cool. And I can learn about the past in order to be a better human now. And I can, incorporate the things that I've learned into my day-to-day life, but I'm not going to somehow, be holier or more spiritual, or, take on some power from, some hangover of Christopher Hitchens' essence or something, and I'm not saying that you're saying that, but like, I think that that's a very different way that we approach places and objects and stuff than what oftentimes religious people do when they set up holy sites or holy objects.
Yeah, it's too bad. Someone's got to come up with that, because that could really, be a big moneymaker. So next time you're on. So tell me, you try to do a 2D to 3D thing. You've had a conference called the Faithless Forum, which I believe you've done. Has it been in Dallas in the past?
We did it.
I moved around the Southwest a little bit.
We did it for 2 years in Dallas, and then this year we're shooting for Austin, Texas. The date that we're shooting for is depending on how things go, June 19th. Obviously with the coronavirus, that is very much complicating things, and it is very much it's crippling our marketing efforts. It's raising severe concerns over whether or not the virus is still going to be, extremely prevalent then, or whether or not it's going to be more seasonal like the flu. And once the warmer months of, April and May hit in, maybe it's going to completely recede and it'll be safe to go out, and the CDC will be like, all right, it's fine, proceed business as usual. Either way, we're not really marketing it right now just because, there's a lot of unknowns. And we have on our website, we have a statement up that says, right now we're playing it as wait and see. We're closely watching what the CDC is saying, what they're putting out. We're going to do everything in our power to adhere to and follow any governmental guidelines by the city of Austin, by our county, the state of Texas, as well as federal guidelines. And that said, if we do wind up having to postpone the conference, then we absolutely will for the safety of all attendees. If that's the case, then okay, we'll be back in 2021. We'll make sure that the Faithless Forum has been growing. It's been thriving. It has been extremely positive. It's brought people together, brought the entire YouTube community together, because where else can you go and see all of your favorite YouTubers, atheist and skeptic YouTubers, all hanging out, having drinks with them, getting food, just getting to collaborate, be inspired, learn, do workshops, learn from them how they do what they do and how you can get involved. It's an amazing community. It's an amazing experience. The last 2 years have been fantastic. And whether we wind up, whether coronavirus is still going strong in June and we have to cancel, or whether if it's not and we're able to proceed, either way, it's going to be a fantastic conference, whatever year we hold it in.
Well, it's good that there are still conferences going on. It seems like I hear more about ones being canceled, and that's before coronavirus situation happened. So it's always good to hear. So I hear, with the coronavirus situation, it's affecting people a lot in this country. Is it affecting you as a content creator? Because when people support you, have you seen that this might affect your, basically your living?
Yeah. So there's two ways that it's been affecting me. Actually, 3 ways. 3 large ways, and then there's ways that it affects everyone. But first of all, in terms of how I normally work, I get distracted working from home. So like, I love to go out to coffee shops. I love to go out to co-working spaces and things like that. But for the last, week or two, I've pretty much kind of been just holed up in my house. The first week, not because coronavirus was at like national disaster levels, but more because I was trying to get a video out. And so I was just like, I was working all night from home. And then once I got that video out, then they're like, all right, national state of emergency. And I was like, damn it. Now I need I've been holed up this whole time. I want to just go out and like be around people for like a day or two. And they're like, no, social distancing, isolate yourself. And I was like, fine. Okay. And then get my groceries delivered, stay home, but as far as Patreon and paying the bills, I do this full time, and I do make these videos and get the message out there to try to combat a lot of the fundamentalism, the religious extremism, the literalism that can cause a lot of harm and damage, the denigration of atheists. I try to push back against a lot of that. I try to fight for the separation of church and state. And the way that I'm able to do this full time, I do make some money from Google AdSense, but not nearly enough to pay the bills, to pay rent, and to be able to put food on the table. And so I rely heavily on Patreon. It's a crowdfunded show. And so far, people have been very supportive, and I haven't really had a lot of people cancel their Patreon stuff, but I'm kind of waiting to see just how bad it is come the beginning of April, because typically, Patreon won't charge people until the end of the month. And my guess is that people will see a charge and they'll be like, oh, I need to cancel that. And I'm probably going to lose a good chunk, just because this is affecting everyone in the economy. It's affecting people. They're not able to, go to work. Their jobs, they're not getting paychecks. People live paycheck to paycheck. A massive percentage of Americans do. And so if all of a sudden everyone is out of work, then that 100% will affect me, and it 100% will affect my ability to make ends meet. I don't know how much yet. I'm hoping that I can just tighten my belt a little bit and be really, really careful and still get by, but I don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and it kind of remains to be seen.
Well, as somebody who's a full-time content creator, so you put yourself out there a lot, so your personality's out there, and of course in animated form as well. But do you have any special talent, skills, maybe even a special karaoke song you might go to that maybe your fan base doesn't quite know about yet?
Skills.
Skills,
yeah. I would say that there's a lot of things that I picked up, a lot of skills that I picked up that I would not call myself anywhere near professional, or not, like I would not necessarily do them competitively. But there are things like when I was in college, I would do some like gymnastics, and I could do like backflips off of stuff. And I wouldn't necessarily call myself, I wouldn't say that I was doing parkour off of, triple gainers off of buildings or anything.
Yeah,
But,
if you could do that in your studio, it's probably a pretty small area. It'd be impressive.
Yeah. And then, I mean, as a kid, I had a lot of like hobbies. I do like rollerblading, and like I do, jumps and things and tricks off of stuff. I did some like breakdancing stuff and like freestyle dancing. I did. I used to have, as a kid, one of those Chinese yo-yos, the Diablos. I used to play with those and like toss them way up in the air and do tricks and stuff. And I got pretty good at it as a kid, I think. I don't know what skills or talents I could show here.
Well,
I'm good at video editing.
Some things to the imagination. So last time we talked, you did mention that you were looking into an animation.
I can do that.
There you go, for the video people. That you're gonna have a new animation suite that allowed you to do like live animations. Has that come to fruition? Obviously, we won't do that tonight, but this could be, another time.
Yeah. So I did actually get that working, and I have like an animated character that I can use for live shows if I need to. I can always fall back on, and I have a what I use is I have like a Adobe Character Animator, and then there's like a couple other programs that have to run on top of it to get it to all work together, to then put it as like a virtual camera that puts a live animated character that tracks my eyes and my mouth and everything together. The problem is with that system is that there's a lot of points of failure with it. And if one of those mini programs were to crash or to fluke out for even just a fraction of a second, then the stream completely, like the video feed completely goes out. And so I kind of was avoiding it for that reason, just because it was like it works maybe 55% of the time, but that's just not enough to, have a reliable show without it. Like, oh, there goes this video again. Oh, there goes this video again. And I figure, I'm not anonymous. I don't hide my face or my name. I'm out there fully for people to see. And so if people, if I was wanting to hide my face and do it anonymously, I could do a live cartoon like that. If I was ever somewhere where I had horrible lighting and I'm, traveling or something, and I were to go on the road again, then I might resort to a live cartoon character, because I won't be in a nice studio setup. I won't be somewhere where I can just sit down and it's like, okay, lighting's good. I can, go do a shower, take a shower and look fine and hop on camera. If I'm like on the road and I'm like, okay, I've got a show coming up and I'm in my car and I'm on a Wi-Fi hotspot, well, I can just pop it open and have little cartoon me talking to the camera. So it's very useful or if you're in like a hotel room or something, you just want to pop open your laptop and go live and still look really professional, then that is a solution. And so I've kind of kept it as a tool in the back pouch, but I haven't really used it yet.
Well, we'll try to do it more often than 2.5 years, but next time we'll have the cartoon version. You do some breakdance maybe, and then when it breaks, the real version can come out, and that'll be totally fine. So where can people find you online? I don't think you're hard to find, but let's make it easier.
So if you type Holy Koolaid into almost any search bar, it should come right up. I am on YouTube as Holy Koolaid. That's my biggest presence. And I'm on Twitter at Holy Koolaid, Facebook /Holy Koolaid. Or if you go to holykoolaid.com, you've got all my links there. If you want to contact me or support my work, or there's resources there for how to find an atheist community, find atheist podcasts, YouTube channels, conferences. I've got all that stuff neatly packaged up there. I even have a guide for, it's not a free guide, but I do have a guide there for how to get started in activism, how to get your voice out there and start making videos and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff on that site. Or if you want to go to our conference, the next one coming up, whenever it is, faithlessforum.com and it's the Atheist YouTube / Skeptic YouTubers conference. So any of those places.
There you go. Well, thank you, Thomas, for coming back on the show. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for having me on.